All right, welcome to the January meeting of Space Iceland. We have, I think, quite an interesting meeting this time. So this time around we have two speakers. Katherine Gizinski, the Chief Executive Officer of Mansat Group. Some of you might know that Mansat has an office in Iceland and they do satellite filing. It's going to be quite interesting. And also Ágúst H. Bjarnason, engineer that was present at the French Space Agency for test launches in the 60s from Iceland. So it's an interesting thing that since Space Iceland came into existence, we keep finding these sort of historical participations, or where Iceland has been quite fortunate to tag along for some space-related activities. And the French launches are actually fairly unknown. We found them on a site called Leirvogur, which is sort of a weird and wonderful news site. They do kind of strange things. So that would be quite interesting. We need to start with a few announcements on what we've been doing. So this obviously is the first meeting of the new year. And we're kind of just getting back to things. First, I want to start with congratulations and just sort of mention that Jón Atli, the president of the University of Iceland, was awarded the Knight's Cross by the president, Knight's Cross of the Order of the Falcon, for his contribution to science and innovation in the field of remote sensing, Earth observation, and digital imaging. So obviously we sent him congratulations, as we do so often when people do extraordinary things, and also when they get recognition for it. It's also, even though obviously the honor is his and his alone, it's still recognition for the developing space sector. So that's quite a good start of a new year. And another thing that we want to just point out to you guys is that Iceland has a fund called the Student Innovation Fund, which allows students to create projects or collaborations with companies or institutions and apply to get their wages paid for 3 months, so a summer job in a sense. It's sort of like a paid internship, because frankly we've pointed out on every occasion that we feel like the wages should be a little bit higher than they are. But it's still a nice opportunity and a way for Space Iceland and the space sector in Iceland, and also international collaborators to contribute to creating opportunities for those students that want to create or work in space or want to create their own. So you will receive information on this tomorrow through our newsletter, but we urge all of you to kind of come up with projects that you might be interested in having a student working on. It is important that these projects are for the development of the students. This is not free labor and should not be treated as such. It actually comes with quite a lot of work, but by joining this, we can help develop some projects. Last summer we had 7 students, and this year we will go sort of the same route of being willing to sponsor whatever projects that have some relation and are of benefit for the space sector. On January 13th at 15 o'clock GMT, we'll have a meeting with students where they can kind of pitch projects or get some information. And if any of you want to co-host the project, we're willing to host the student at our office, and we can work together. So the limitation is that these students have to be residents of Iceland. It is open for international students. We've had an international student on one of those projects. And international cooperation is encouraged, but they have to be located in Iceland and students in Iceland or studying in Iceland. So that's about it. We'll send you information on this, but definitely give it a thought if you have any projects that you think could be beneficial, and we'll co-host it with you and hopefully create an opportunity for a student. It's quite a good fund, because actually quite a lot of Icelandic startup companies have originated from that 3-month period where students get enough wages to pay rent, or like barely to pay rent, but still can work on a project and then go further. But I think there's no reason to talk more unless there are any questions about Space Iceland. But I see our speaker, Katherine Gizinski, is here. And can you turn on your mic and confirm that you can hear us?
Yes, can you all hear me?
Brilliant. Yes, I think so.
Great.
All right, so I'm gonna put you on the spotlight here, and if you don't mind, you can just start and introduce yourself.
Terrific. So I'm Katherine Gizinski with ISTAT, and of course our parent company, Mansat. We established ourselves in Iceland just a couple of years ago, and are doing some pretty exciting things there. So what I'll do is sort of walk through our history, what we were doing before, what brought us to Iceland, and of course what we're doing there now, and what's on the agenda moving forward. So I will attempt to share my screen. Bear with me. This should always go smoothly, but you never know. So stand by. I may not have the permissions to do so.
All right. Do you want to send us the slides, or you can restart Zoom, because you have permission on our end?
Yes, for whatever reason, it won't allow me to do so. So yes, let me pass that along to you. My apologies.
Oh, brilliant. No worries. All right. So if you've emailed it, I'll share it as soon as it arrives. Here it is.
Ah, wonderful. Okay.
No, it's not here yet.
Oh.
There was another email from you, but you can continue, and I'll put it up.
Great. So yes, I'll get started, and we can have the graphics catch up. So again, thank you all for your time, your attention. I realize this afternoon there's still morning for me here in the United States. But again, a pleasure to be with all of you and share with you a little bit about what we're doing. Our focus is international spectrum regulation. And I'll be talking with you a little bit about what that means, what that is, and of course the pivotal role that plays in the space industry more broadly, certainly it's a global activity. Satellite services and space missions are a global activity by nature. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I understand there's sort of a varied audience, and you'd be surprised by the number of folks that have spent 20, 30, 40 years in the industry and don't appreciate this critical sort of niche focus of regulation in their daily activities. So if you have questions, I look forward to addressing those. All right. So first, I'll give a little bit of background, as I mentioned. Here we go. Perfect. All right. Next slide, if you would. Thank you. Oh, back one. There we are. So as I mentioned, first, I'll give a little bit of background on what we do at ISAT and our parent company, Mansat, and what this means. Then we'll briefly walk through the basics of commercial spectrum licensing and the process for obtaining a license. But most importantly, we'll talk about why this regulation matters and how space companies can transition from treating regulation, in all honesty, as a potentially catastrophic afterthought to proactively driving that regulatory dialogue and folding regulatory considerations into project and system planning at the outset. And then finally, we'll look at an exciting area for us, how regulation affects new missions and new technologies. And where do we go from here? Can we leverage the existing regulatory frameworks to enable the incredible and disruptive innovation that we're seeing that's percolating throughout the industry? And then ultimately, how do we parlay that into a sustainable space industry for all of us, recognizing that really a fundamental change in the pace at which the space industry moves. Next slide, please. Okay, so as promised, first, who we are and what we do. I borrowed this graphic from Northern Sky Research. They put this out for us, and it's my favorite because I didn't make it. For 20 years, Mansat has been, again, our parent company, has been the largest commercial provider of spectrum in the world. And we started out offering access to satellite spectrum through the Isle of Man in the UK. And after 20 years of lessons learned in the Isle of Man, working with our clients across jurisdictions throughout the world and expanding into market access and a whole host of other expertise categories, we now offer access to satellite spectrum through Iceland with our subsidiary ISAT, and I'll talk a little bit more specifically on what that change looked like in a moment. So when I say access to spectrum and working on that through Iceland, what I mean is that, of course, under contract, we act on behalf of a local administration with regard to ITU, or International Telecommunications Union, satellite spectrum filings. We are and I'll define those a bit more in a minute, and kind of walk through what the most important pieces of that are. But the key distinction for us and for what we do is we are, of course, a commercial company ensuring clients fulfill their regulatory obligation and ultimately performing what is often a regulatory function in different jurisdictions. So we try to take a different approach to it, and this allows us to certainly ensure strict adherence to the regulation, but also make the process a bit more approachable and transparent for the operators. This has historically been a challenge and a major stumbling block for operators globally. We support geostationary, non-geostationary lunar and deep space missions. And so public domain, I can share with you that we look after spectrum for Loral Skynet, Viasat, Telesat, EchoStar, SkyPerfect JSAT, as well as Earth observation and GSO constellations and a number of others. So this is kind of what we do, what we live and breathe. And again, we've been doing this for quite some time. Finally, and I'll say this proudly because we're certainly proud of it. We are very proud that every year global operators and startups alike choose us They're not required to work with ISAT or Mansat, but choose us to guide them through this critical aspect of moving from an idea to ultimately providing global services to a range of customers. And again, we take that approach of, rather than a no, you can't, that can come sometimes working with different administrations, to, how can we create a collaborative discussion that ultimately ensures that our clients can provide the services they need, and of course that the regulation is strictly followed. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please. Great, thanks, Sarah. I will not read this very heavy slide and graphic, but I'll touch briefly on that. Separate from our regulatory work, our consulting group advises on all aspects of international spectrum regulation. There's a lot of expertise captured in this chart. Our primary focus, and again, this is kind of woven throughout all of our business areas, is we try to help our clients decipher and navigate complex processes and regulations and make that as approachable as possible. We help them navigate all aspects of the satellite spectrum filing process in Iceland, Geneva, around the world, and the various facets of that complex and critical process. We lead campaigns at the World Radio Conferences to advocate for new spectrum allocation. And again, we'll talk more about that in a moment as it pertains to new technologies. And we support the shaping of new regulations to support and allow groundbreaking technologies to ultimately enter the market. Which, again, as someone that's been in this industry for a while, what's available now, what's happening now, the pace at which it's happening is really, really different than it's been in the past. And again, finally, helping our clients obtain market access across virtually any jurisdiction, whether that's just provide broadcast services or simply a landing rights for downlinking data. Next slide, please. Okay. This brings us to ISAT. As I mentioned, we took everything we learned in the Isle of Man and in all of the jurisdictions we've represented our clients in over the last 20 years and worked with the fantastic folks at the PTA in Iceland to establish a regulatory regime for satellite filings in Iceland. This is incredible. Dr. Jayasuriya worked very closely with those folks. Dr. Jennifer Stone is now our primary liaison with the administration. They've been fantastic. Certainly put us through our paces and took a close look at all the regulatory regimes to determine for themselves whether or not our recommendations were sound, and they were. And so here we are, which is, again, something we're very, very proud of. Iceland's regulatory regime is really the gold standard in terms of course, strict adherence to international regulation, but also offering a streamlined 21st century process which supports more readily the pace and the nature of the modern space industry. I won't bore you too much comparing and contrasting Iceland with some of the other jurisdictions, but I'll pick on one because I sit in it. The US filing jurisdiction is incredibly challenging. And so if you talk with new space startups within the US that are wrestling with their regulators, though the folks at the FCC here are certainly trying to do their job well, the process itself is not as supportive of innovation and new space companies as it could be. And so it's an active issue that a lot of folks are wrestling with, startups, large operators, and again, it has a huge impact to their bottom line. And I'll get more to mechanically how and why that is in a moment. But just speaking more generally, when it comes to variables and value drivers for filing jurisdictions, again, Iceland offers its operators every advantage on the global stage. So of course, assured spectrum access is key. I'll talk about kind of how there's an interplay between the national and an international regulation, but ultimately, each nation can overlay its own regulation on top of the international standards. And what this means in various countries is there are certain pieces of spectrum that are just completely, wholly inaccessible to commercial operators. And that's certainly a huge challenge, because if you're a space operator in a given jurisdiction, you want to provide global services, you recognize that there will be some accommodations required to serve certain markets. But rather than being able to address that globally, you can't even submit the paperwork, because the spectrum you intend to use in other countries, you cannot access through your home jurisdiction. So again, Iceland's approach here is very pragmatic, and we're very happy with that. So again, that's assured spectrum access. Expedience. I will talk in a moment a little bit about priority, which is huge. The time for a request or a filing to reach the ITU is critical. The time date establishes priority, which establishes claim to the frequency allocations, and it's huge. I mean, it's just the whole ball of wax. So again, ISAT's process is phenomenally quick, certainly relative to other administrations where you're looking at a 6-month delay, up to a 6-month delay, and a lot of other volatility. Market access is another key variable and value driver. Of course, Iceland's advantages, from standing with the WTO, with NATO, with OECD, access to the CEPT, these are all helpful for adjacent regulatory activities, certainly when it comes to serving different markets, that not all jurisdictions have that same advantage. And finally, stability. So stable government, stable, predictable rule of law, and a strong economy are key considerations for global operators. I won't bore you with anecdotes, but there have been a few times that a change in political leadership has meant that a major operator no longer has claim to their spectrum, which sounds crazy if you sit in Iceland or if you sit in other jurisdictions where that's never a risk, but it has happened in others. So again, that's a key consideration. Okay, next slide. All right, now we get to the part of why this matters, why space operators are concerned with this, satellite operators are concerned with this, and really why it needs to be at the forefront of our planning. It's easy and understandable to focus on the incredible feats of engineering rather than the regulation when we think of space ventures, whether that's satellite constellations, commercial missions to the moon and Mars, pick your variation. But for our purposes, I want you all to remember, no license, no mission. So no spectrum access, no business. This is absolutely a fundamental building block to a commercially successful venture. You cannot get on a launch vehicle without a spectrum license or assured access to spectrum. You can't really mature a comms architecture without a path to legal operation. Spectrum and spectrum regulation has to be a key consideration at the outset. This isn't about what you can do technically or what you want to do commercially. This is about what you can legally do. And so again, this is where we stand with our clients and really try to walk them through this process and make it, rather than a frustration they're raging against, woven into the fabric of their planning and thinking process. Now, the requirement to get a spectrum license for operation applies to, like I said, all activities in space. So commercial satellite services, on-orbit servicing, lunar missions, Mars missions, all of it needs a license. All right, we'll go on to the next. Okay, now at a high level, I'll start with the fundamentals of international space regulation. And if this is a review for some of you, forgive me. I know we have a diverse audience, and again, there are some nuances to these that can get lost. So forgive me if I'm a little too thorough. There are three verticals of regulation when operating in space. And spectrum regulation is pertinent to each of these. So even if some of these processes are sort of adjacent to that initial step with the ITU filing, again, it's a consideration in all aspects. So first we have spectrum licensing at the ITU, spacecraft, or there's sort of diversity in terms, but a physical spacecraft license, or a launch and operations license. And then finally, market access or landing rights. The first two, spectrum and launch and operation, or spectrum and spacecraft, I sometimes refer to it as for simplicity, flow from UN treaties. The third, landing rights or market access, really has to do with your ability to serve a given market at the national level. So we'll start with the first. The ITU deals with spectrum regulation, and that's our domain. The ITU is who you go to obtain international recognition for frequency assignments, or more colloquially, get your spectrum. In parallel, a launch and operations license or spacecraft license deals with the liability for the launching nation state. And this lists your spacecraft or spacecrafts on the UN Register of Space Objects. Now, remember my sort of crude graphic, no spectrum license, no launch. Your launching nation state, though they're really looking at the spacecraft liability itself, your launching nation state will need to know that you have a spectrum license before they're willing to issue a spacecraft or a launch and operation license. Of course, there being the idea being, of course, if you have a spacecraft and you cannot communicate with it or cannot provide services, there's certainly a concern. So practically, that's certainly a consideration. Finally, as I mentioned, there we go. Market access or landing rights. So this is sort of the other half of the spectrum regulation area that we work in. This speaks to the ability to land your spectrum in a given nation state, whether it's to provide broadcast services to an entire jurisdiction, to an entire market, or simply downlink data or for tracking, telemetry, and control. Again, that's all within the landing rights or market access category. All right, now that we've covered the basics of getting into space legally, we'll focus on spectrum regulation specifically. So move on to the next slide. Okay. The International Telecommunication Union, or ITU, is the arm of the United Nations that's tasked with enforcing the world radio regulations with regard to spectrum. It has 193 member states, so it's part of the UN, but has more members than the UN. The fundamental purpose of the regulation is to prevent harmful interference. And just kind of practically speaking, you can think a little bit about harmful interference to national interests would certainly be concerning, and harmful interference to commercial enterprises, where the lifeblood of a company is at stake, also critical. So again, the goal here is to prevent harmful interference. This is accomplished through what's called the filing process, or having a satellite filing. And it, again, applies to all spacecraft. Sometimes some of the folks doing lunar missions or deep space missions kind of cringe at the use of satellite. They say, no, we're spacecraft, we're a fleet of spacecraft, but ultimately it applies to all spacecraft. Now, what does a filing get you? A filing is the legal mechanism through which an operator obtains international recognition of frequency assignments. Okay, on to the next slide, please. Okay, now, when it comes to the process itself, I will keep this overview high level for the purpose of our discussion. I also will not cover market access, as it varies country by country. And most satellite services are global in nature, so I don't want to bog us down too much. Again, we know the objective here is no harmful interference. So how do we accomplish this mechanically? Kind of stepping back, think of all the national defense-oriented and commercial satellite systems at play. And I'm sure a lot of you follow the news about the new systems coming online and the mind-boggling numbers of satellites, of spacecraft that are planned. So what's bringing order to the industry from an RF spectrum perspective? So the key here is this concept of priority, which I mentioned earlier. So at a fundamental level, the ITU functions on a first come, first served basis. So once a filing, and I'll camp on that for a moment. I mean, truly first come, first served. So we're looking at date and timestamps to establish which filing has priority. Now, once a filing is initiated at the ITU, the operator has 7 years to either use or lose the desired spectrum they've filed for. So meaning 7 years to productively coordinate with other operators and administrations, address interference issues so that it can claim or bring into use or notify, depending on the sort of nuances of the applicable regulation, so that it can claim those frequency assignments. Now, practically speaking, it takes anywhere from 2 to 7 years to actually claim the frequency assignments in a filing, depending on the specifics of the system and the applicable regulation. But if the filing expires at the end of that 7 years, the operator doesn't claim those desired frequencies, and it loses its spot in line. And again, that's key because for a large geostationary operator, 7 years is not as long of a timeline as you might think. And if there are delays that sort of push them, even if it's by a month past that 7-year deadline, that's it. It's a use or lose deadline. So again, this is key. It can be managed in many ways, but it's a key consideration, a key process. Now, if an operator does successfully claim its spectrum, then it has to defend that spectrum from subsequent filings, from subsequent claims for that same spectrum. So the job of pursuing and protecting, the protecting part of the pursuing and protecting process is never done. It's an active and ongoing process. And as some of you may know, there's a lot of pressure, not just between operators, but from terrestrial interests as well. So I'll touch briefly on that next. Next slide, please. Okay, so regulation changes. I'll talk about new technologies and certainly pressure from terrestrial interests as well. But now that you understand the basics of the ITU filing process and existing rules of the road, to put it simply, let's talk about change. If, when, and how would the rules change? This is a question of tremendous importance as we look to new capabilities and commercial missions to the moon, to Mars, IoT applications, and importantly as well, with the pressure from 5G, from other terrestrial interests. So with that in mind, every 3 to 4 years, a WRC or World Radio Conference is held to address these issues. The last one took place in 2019, and the next is slated for 2023. A little bit of a rocky start. It's a 4-year planning process for a reason. That there are a lot of folks working diligently for a full 4 years to prepare for those conferences, and certainly the lack of in-person meetings to hash through these issues has been a bit challenging. But again, that 2023 date is still in place. It typically takes 1 or sometimes 2 WRCs to get an item on the agenda for a future WRC. So you can kind of get the idea, this is not a blistering pace. What does this mean for near-term commercial ventures? Well, we have to use the existing regulations as they are now to advance toward our objectives in the near term, while simultaneously advocating for change, for the necessary change through the established process at the WRCs. Again, to just put a time number on it, if it takes me 1 cycle to get my item on the agenda, I've got another cycle where there are studies taking place, and then finally a 3rd cycle where there's change, we're talking about on the order of 9 to 12 years. If you're a commercial company, that's a big challenge. There are times it can be a little bit sooner, or you can kind of dovetail into certain agenda items to try to accelerate that as much as possible. But again, the regulation by definition is not intended to be overly reactive to the industry interests. It's supposed to be methodical. Now, the benefit is that when you take this sort of 2-pronged approach, of course, leveraging the existing regulations to the best of your ability, and then again, advancing change through the established process, when that new regulation comes, the existing filings is strategically advantaged over subsequent filings. Okay, I think I'm coming to the end of my time, so I will touch briefly on the next slide to say, again, a little bit about regulatory support for future capabilities. So again, we talked about the process, we talked about the change, we talked about new capabilities. So I want to camp on this topic a little bit more because I know that can be a little bit discouraging when we talk about the WRC process and how long it can take for change to occur for some of those really bleeding edge technologies. When you look at the existing satellite industry today, we see that the regulatory framework has enabled about a $400 billion industry. It's built for commercial operation. The goal is to, of course, enable commercial activity in an orderly fashion. We've seen the effect of priority at the ITU have a huge impact on the competitive landscape. Again, that first come, first served concept. And folks leveraging that in anticipation of new regulation that's come. There's an example from the WRC 19 conference where there was a huge change made in the middle of that conference that was much faster than expected. And the folks that were looking toward regulatory change when they made their filings, when they were advancing coordination, were positioned well to absorb that change and again, to carry forward that advantage. And again, the national regulation and access to the process varies from country to country. So that has a number of implications as well. Again, priority, costs, et cetera. So now we know where the industry stands. We know how folks have worked through this framework and process to bring new technologies to the market before. And then again, a reminder, all commercial missions and satellite systems have the same requirement. They all have to have a spectrum license to legally operate. They all need to leverage the existing regulatory frameworks, even if they aspire to establish new ones. And we live and breathe this daily, the strategic considerations, both the immediate term and longer term. And I'll leave you with a closing thought to spectrum is a finite resource and a defining resource for commercial ventures and for national interests as well. And when we encourage space operators to embrace this regulatory reality early, we not only help them avoid a stumbling block, but we understand how valuable these little slivers of real estate on the RF spectrum are. And again, this activity of pursuing and protecting the spectrum that enables us to connect the unconnected, to expand economies, and to carry out missions is an important job and an important focus for us. So with that's all I have for today. Thank you again for your time, and I'm looking forward to answer any questions that you may have.
So yeah, thank you for that. So I think it's best, we usually take questions at the end, but we'll probably go a little bit over time because we have an interesting talk as well after this one. If you have any questions, you can just message in the chat and we'll give you time to ask it, or you can send it to us. Anyone willing? We haven't received any questions yet. Well, I'll ask them as usual. So can you tell us a bit how it came about that you started looking into Iceland? Because from what we understand, I mean, the preparation for ISAT is actually considerably older than Space Iceland. So we were kind of not thinking on these terms when you started looking towards Iceland.
Sure. So what brought us to Iceland? Well, again, we have been doing our work in the Isle of Man for about 20 years. And the key considerations when we looked at a new jurisdiction were stable government, which of course Iceland has, I think, longest running internationally, and stable and understood rule of law. Again, as you can imagine, for a global satellite operator that's spending $500 million on a geostationary satellite, with, sometimes there's joint ventures and a number of other activities, there's a lot riding on this. And so an understanding of the rule of law and stability and its application was critical as well. And finally, a sustainable, stable economy. Again, we looked at some other jurisdictions, and we are familiar with, friends in the industry that have looked at some of those jurisdictions that are really pleasant to visit in the winter months. But the stability in the economy, stability in political leadership, and stability in the rule of law is really lacking. And so there are a lot of lessons learned from others in the industry who have gone a little bit more aggressive in their approach to different jurisdictions, and then from us, what has worked for our clients, what hasn't. And again, that streamlined process, the ability to apply a streamlined process with tremendous support from the PTA is huge, because timing is really critical. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Yeah, it was. Yeah, thank you. All right, we have a question, so that's great. Andrew, do you want to ask it, or should I just read it out? Well, yeah, I'll just read it out then. There's a question from Andrew Ball. If a research satellite measures unregulated RFI from Icelandic territory, would ISAT offer help to address the issue? Sure,
absolutely. So when it comes to, and this is a question I get a lot about, certainly in the earlier stages of various technologies, folks will say, well, it's really unlicensed or it's unregulated, so on. What do we need to do? So what we've done at ISAT is we have created a service that's really geared towards some of these non-commercial interests. Sometimes this is for research purposes, sometimes it's just test and demonstration. Again, because no matter what, to ensure there's no harmful interference, even if your technical evidence indicates that this would be a concern, the ITU wants and needs to know about it. So yes, that's something we can absolutely help with, advise you on the applicable regulation, and then guide you through the appropriate process to move forward, again, above board.
All right. Thank you. Well, there's a tradition at these meetings because we usually have some politicians and I usually force them to ask a question, but this time around we have no elected officials, so that's that's about it. I think we should introduce our, Sirion from the Post and Telecom actually has a comment. So please, Sirion, I'll put you on the spot. Remember to turn on your mic.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to thank Katherine for this excellent presentation, and we are very much looking forward to working with you at Mansat and ISAT in the future. Yeah, and it's nice to finally see you on the video screen. We've never actually met, but we've been exchanging emails. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. We're looking forward to it too. It is, I know, I probably would have been there in person a number of times at this point, but until then I'll sit on my hands and keep pacing from my office to the kitchen to a lap around my house.
All right, thank you guys. So our next speaker is Ágúst. He's going to talk about some test launches that the French Space Agency did in the 60s from Iceland. And well, Ágúst is probably the one that has documented this the best, and actually will have quite a lot of photos. So Ágúst, if you turn on your microphone, I'll put the spotlight on you. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can all hear you.
Unmute just a moment.
No, you are unmuted. So.
Okay. My name is Ágúst Bjarnason, and I am an engineer, electrical engineer. I am 75 years old. I was at the site in 1964 and 1965. I was around 20 then. And I had the opportunity to take many photos. I had the camera with me with a Kodachrome slides film, and I have assembled all the photos I have in the PowerPoint file I'm going to show you. Can you see it full screen now, Thor?
Yes, works perfectly.
Okay. This is my first slide. This PowerPoint file is rather big. It is 45 slides. Many of them have mainly text, and I will more or less skip over them and concentrate on the pictures. I guess I have about 20 pictures or something like that. But just in addition to the introduction, I have a master science degree in electrical engineering from University of Iceland and Lund, Sweden. I have been working at the engineering company Rafmagnatekni and also recently Verkís. I was a lecturer at the University of Iceland for 15 years. During my student years, I worked during the summers at the Post and Telegraph Administration's laboratory and at the Science Institute, High Altitude Division. As an amateur, I observed satellite orbits over Iceland. It was sponsored by the Royal Society in England. And my hobbies, they include amateur radio, astronomy, forestry, model flying, and photography. So that is about me. I think I'm going to skip over this more or less because there's mainly text. But French rockets, they were sent up to 440 kilometers, and that is higher than the International Space Station. I just checked it yesterday, and it is now 419 kilometers high. So the rockets were really advanced. I was at the site on behalf of the state civil defense, and it was therefore that I had the opportunity to enjoy the 4 space launches from close, and I could walk freely around the site and even into the control room. I always had the camera with me. All the pictures I have presented are from the summer 1964, but I think I have some. I must have some pictures somewhere from 1965, but I have not been able to find them. Just mention 3 persons. Ágúst H, he is a nuclear engineer. He was the director of the state civil defense during the 1964. And Jóhann Jakobsson, chemical engineer, he was director next year, 1965. But I was lucky to know both of them personally before the launches, and that helped me really. Dr. Þorsteinn Sæmundsson, he's an astronomer at the Science Institute, and he was the main scientific contact here in Iceland with the French scientists. The purpose of the rocket launches was to study the Van Allen belt as it gets close to Earth, near the poles, where auroras are often visible. These 2 pictures, we have the sun here, the solar wind, we have the Van Allen belt just around the Earth, and the magnetosphere. And this is a more detailed picture if you would like to study it. But the main purpose was to study the Van Allen belt. We can see the Van Allen belt here in the lower picture, and it is more or less symmetrical around Earth. The Dragon rocket is about 7 meters high, and it is here with its brothers in the center here, the Dragon. The main data, the max altitude was 475 kilometers. Thrust at launch was 75 kilonewtons, that is about 7 metric tons. Mass at launch was 1,160 kilograms. Diameter of the lower section was 56 centimeters. Wingspan at the lower section was 123 centimeters. Length about 7 meters. Maximum payload 60 kilograms. And the fuel solid 686 kilograms in the lower section and 208 in the upper sections. The Dragon launches from Iceland were during the August and September in the year 1964 and 1965. And you see the altitude was always around 440 kilometers. In this map of Iceland, I have put 2 arrows. To the right here is marked 1964, that is launched from Mýrdalssandur. And to the left, 1965, is a launch from Skógarsandur. You can see Skógar, the Hotel Skógar, and the waterfall. The Skógar is around here. And the launch was just to the east of the hotel. You can also note here Eyjafjallajökull. You may remember the volcanic activity about 10 years ago from Eyjafjallajökull, so very famous. Reykjavík here, and so on. I have another map. This is more detailed, and this is more or less 3-dimensional. The location 1964 at Mýrdalssandur is almost exactly where the arrow points, at least not very far from this part. and the launch site in 1965, and Skógarsandur is very near this point here. You can see the Eyjafjallajökull glacier here, and Vestmann Islands, the small town Vík is here, and Reykjavík to the far left. It took some time to locate the launching pads, so I was in contact with two gentlemen. One of them was a policeman in South Iceland. Sveinn is his name. I think his full name is Sveinn Rúnarsson. I'm not sure about this, but I tried to connect his nickname with this name here. So this photo is of the policeman in South Iceland. And he sent me some information, and also Ágúst Guðmundsson. He sent me some information, and he was able to locate both launching pads, both on Google Maps and also on site. This is a picture from Google Maps. This is a launch pad that you see here. This is a direction of flight to the bottom right. This is some hut used for, I think, local control equipment, but the control room is probably here. I tried to blow up this picture, but I cannot see anything more detailed. I found this map at my Merkis. We were sorting some old stuff 6 years ago when I found this map, and we can see on this map the location of the launch in 1965 is marked here with exact coordinates. So this was also very helpful, and I was lucky to find this map. This map shows the site in 1964 in Mýrdalssandur, and the launch pad, we have it here, launch pad, and the control center is here. This is Hjörleifshöfði, a small mountain in the middle of the sand, and this is the mountain where we Höfðabrekka mountain, we can call it Höfðabrekkuheiði or Höfðabrekka mountain. This is also from Google Maps. Let me just take a better look here. So yes, the control center is here, and this picture shows the location of the control center. It's probably this one. That is the location of the control center. Here. No, that is launchpad. Launchpad is here. And control center is here. This is the control center. Skógarsandur 1965. We have seen the launch pad, but this is a location I found on the map that I found at Merkis. This is something I found on the internet. You can see the 4 launches are marked here. The name Moser, he was an American scientist. He was responsible for studying the Van Allen belts. This is Leirvogur Magnetic Observatory. It's about 20 kilometers east of Reykjavík. I was often there when I worked at the Science Institute during 7 months. I shot this picture in 1968 probably, and you see the old equipment. To the left here we have a old prototype of magnetometer. It was built in Iceland, and it's a proton precession magnetometer. This is a clock that starts the measurement every minute or so, every 5 minutes, and this is a recording unit. You see this, it looks very primitive, but the first launch in Iceland was almost directed from Iceland because Þorsteinn Sæmundsson, the astronomer, he looked at the results from the magnetometer and talked to the scientists at the site via radio. As I describe here, just jump over it. This is an old radio station at Melar near the University of Iceland. The Science Institute is here in the back. I think Þorsteinn Sæmundsson sat here with a display from the magnetometer when he was talking to the scientist at the site. Now we have the pictures, old pictures. This is the first picture I have on my film. Hjálmar Sveinsson is working there. He is a little bit older than I am, 77 probably now. And he is living in the USA and has been living there since he finished his studies. Here we can see the rocket, and we can see some transparent set here, protection. And here in the background we have the Hjörleifshöfði. Here the launch pad is ready. They have moved the set a little bit. There's a zoom in from the previous picture. This is the first Dragon rocket, 7 meters long and 1,100 kilograms in weight. Dr. Moser is here to the right. He's holding some instrument. And this is probably short time before launch. This is Moser here. Stromboli engine, you can read Stromboli here. It has been raining this day. We can see it there using yellow rain hats, and they have put some protection over the rocket. This is a Mýrdalsandur Space Center, you can call it. We have all the equipment located here in the control room, and containers and so on. These antennas, the parabolic antennas, are used for communication with the balloon that was sent up before the launch, and also to communicate with the rocket. These antennas are for high frequency, probably on shortwave, maybe for communication with France, and some other antennas here maybe for communication with the balloon, something like that. Here the rocket is almost ready. I think this guy is raising the rocket in correct position. And here it is, ready for launch. Here I am with the Dragon. This is me. Here the rocket is ready for launch. I shot this picture on top of the Höfðabrekka mountain. The Polish, Polish Sigur Ágústsson, Siggi Palestína, as he was usually called. He had worked with the United Nations in Palestine, and he was a really good fellow. His VHF radio was on a Harley Davidson motorcycle, and we had to transport it to the top of the mountain. It was very, very heavy. And he also used a man-pack radio for shortwave bands on the 100 meters band. This is the same picture, but this is on top of the mountain. Now, here the scientists are deciding whether to shoot or not. They are looking at information from the magnetometers and information from the balloon. And sometimes they looked rather stressful because they couldn't decide, shall we shoot now or wait a little longer. But suddenly we saw very bright auroras. It was a corona, and they quickly decided to shoot or launch the rocket as it did. But thinking back, I find this remarkable how much freedom I had when walking around the site and walk into the control room and speak to the scientists and other persons. So I sometimes felt I was a part of the team. That is the same picture. I don't know what this instrument here is, but it can just be a display from other equipment located in another container. I shot this picture of the launch. The camera lens was open for several seconds. I didn't have any tripod, so I had to steady the camera with something that was close to the station's equipment. I think it was some pole or even the container to support the camera. But I was successful to take a picture with the lens open for maybe 5 seconds or so. You can see that the camera had a normal lens, 50mm focal length, so you can see that I am not very far away. Now, here the team is very satisfied, returning to the hotel late in the evening after a successful day. I am in the bus with them, and you see everybody's laughing, and in fact I was almost one of the team, at least this night. This picture is from Dr. Þorsteinn Sæmundsson. He is a retired astronomer at the Science Institute, and he shot this picture in 1965. And we have here Dr. Forrest Moser, the American scientist, Jacques-Émile Blamont, the French scientist. Both of them very famous names. Moser, he became a professor at Berkeley, and Jacques-Émile Blamont, he was definitely France's leading space scientist. You can find them both on Wikipedia. That's the same picture. So Þorsteinn Sæmundsson, the astronomer, he received this commemorative coin in memory of the launches, and also in gratitude of the assistance provided. That was 1964. But I was surprised when I received this coin the next year, 1965. So thank you very much for your attention. And please let me know if you can locate any error in this slideshow, and also if you have some pictures or information that we can add to this slideshow or some blog page. No, this is a picture of me. It was drawn 1966, and you can see I had interest in space, in amateur radio, and so on. So,
all right, are you finished, Ágúst? Should we open
yes,
for questions?
I'm finished now.
All right, if you can stop your screens here. So yeah, we'll open for questions. Just a quick thing I wanna add is that we've been able to contact the National Archives, and we've got heaps of documents now on the legal process from when this happened and the communications. We also contacted the French Space Agency and asked them to have a look at their archives, because actually this is quite, even though it's been quite a long time since it happened, it is actually quite vital information on how some of the legal framework worked, even though quite a lot of it has changed. And we haven't had time to go through it, but we received several hundred pages of communication between French authorities and Iceland. So we have a question from Andrew, and I'm gonna just ask you to ask it yourself. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, very interesting talk. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, perfectly.
Firstly, Jacques Blamont unfortunately died a couple of years ago, but I was honored to have met him in the course of my early career in space and planetary sciences. My first question to you is, why was the launch site moved from 1964 to 1965?
I was actually thinking about this yesterday, but I have no answer why it was, because I think the site at 1964 at Mýrdalsandur, it was quite okay, so I don't know why they moved it.
Yeah, maybe it's in the papers you found in the archives. I'd done a little bit of digging on the internet for these launches myself a year or two ago, and found what you've found on Google Earth or Google Maps. But if you also go to lmi.is, then there's an aerial photography archive, Mansat, where you can find images from before Route 1 was built over the top of the 1964 launch site, and you can see some clear pictures of the launch pad area. And secondly, there's also an online video on a CNES website, which has some nice movie pictures of the launch operations.
I see.
And maybe there's still one person retired but still active as a scientist at an institute called LATMOS near Paris, who is possibly still possibly was involved in those launches. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Could you possibly mail us the addresses you mentioned?
Yes, no problem. Yeah, shall I send them to Thor? And
send them to Thor, yes.
Your mail address is on the web page. I also made a couple of posts on the Facebook page of the Exploration Museum in Húsavík. I thought it would be interesting for them as well.
I see.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I've sent you the email, and we'll forward the links while we send out the minutes. Any other questions that anyone might have? Any talks or comments? Well, I think I'll ask one, if that's okay. I've often wondered about this because as with so many things that have happened in Iceland and missions related to space, it is sort of a forgotten history. You kind of find these by accident or by word of mouth. And I imagine that when this happened, this was quite a big event, and you can see it from the time. It was quite a lot of news coverage of it. But I wonder if it didn't sort of, was there any sort of sense of positivity or sort of inspiration that Iceland was, again, in such, in such a short period of time, participating in space, which at the time was quite a novelty?
Are you asking me, Thor, or?
Yes, I'm asking you, Ágúst.
Yes. I think it may distort my opinion because I was an amateur there. I was both a radio amateur. I was very interested in space. I had built my own telescope, refractor, and so on. So I did much thinking, but I really don't know what everybody else was thinking. Maybe, and I know that some people, because of some accident or something like that, they knew of this rocket launches, but I think that the general public did not know much about it.
All right. Well, thank you for that. If there are no other questions, I think it's time to bid farewell. So we'll send out the minutes, and I hope both Ágúst and Katherine are okay with us sending the slides or forwarding the slides to everyone. The recording will be available on Facebook and YouTube. And again, I just want to remind you guys that we are in the process of we want to be able to support students that want to work in the space sector or create a project for themselves. So please, if you have any projects or anything that you would like to see a student do, you can send us ideas. We have a meeting next week, introductory meeting with the students, and we can kind of pitch them. And we have a meeting next month, as usual. There's a meeting once a month, and it will be on the 4th of February. And next time around, we'll have Space Tea, a Chinese satellite provider that has, throughout the years, been quite interested in Iceland. So they'll talk a bit about what they are doing. All right, thanks everyone. And until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.